The wind over Grenton Hollow had a voice that winter. It didn't howl, not quite. It rasped like breath through split lips. The morning of February 3rd, 1854, that voice carried a stench, lime, mildew, and something else. Something wrong. Mrs. Lottie Green, 63, and still delivering bread on foot through the steep lanes of Wexham Parish, noticed it first. She stopped beside the sagging gate of a house she had not seen opened in over a decade. The house was known in whispers as Elmstead Retreat, a place once run by a religious sect that styled themselves as Sisters of Final Mercy. Lottie's eyes narrowed against the mist, her shawl pressed tightly around her thinning white hair. A curtain had moved, not sharply, not like a person yanking it aside, more like it collapsed inward from age or pressure. And then came the sound. It wasn't a scream, exactly, nor a moan, but it was female, and it was desperate, muffled, low, as if the house itself had sighed in pain. She didn't stay. She left the bread at the gate, turned without knocking, and walked faster than she had in 20 years, straight back to the vicar's cottage. By midday, 4 others had gathered outside Elmstead. Reverend Paul Ellicott, 2 village constables, and the town mason, Edgar Brum. They stood silently in the churned mud of the garden path, each waiting for another to act first. The house stood 3 stories tall, its shutters nailed, its wooden siding bleached soft grey by decades of wind. A crucifix above the door had split diagonally, as if cleaved by lightning. "I don't hear anything," said one constable, a man named Roger Fielding, who had only joined the force 3 weeks prior. Ellicott turned toward the boarded window. "You're not listening the right way." The door had no lock now, just rusted hinges and resistance. When Bram forced it open, a stifled rush of air hit them like rot from a crypt. The constables exchanged a look but stepped inside. It was Reverend Ellicott who found the first sign. A wooden beam in the back parlour had shifted, exposing a segment of wainscoting that did not match the rest. Beneath it, behind the plaster, was a thin cavity no wider than a child's shoulders, but running the length of the hall, and inside that space was cloth, white, stained, pressed flat, and something like fingers. By the following day, word had spread, not just of the discovery, but of the number. The cavity had been one of many. Hidden rooms, false walls, and vertical slots within the very skeleton of the house. What began as a mystery was now a horror too vast to measure. 67. That was the count. 67 female corpses, preserved by lime, silence, and time. No names, no markers, no prayers, just cloth, bone, and what some swore were claw marks scratched into the lathe. The local paper refused to run the full report. It published only a notice. Unsettling findings at Elmstead. Authorities investigating structural anomaly. But diaries and letters from villagers tell the real tale. One letter, penned by a miller's widow named Elsie Crane, reads, "They say the sisters were good women, that they took in the forgotten. But good women don't build houses like that. Good women don't bury the screaming." Some of the women were children, others elderly, all of them dressed in modest linen gowns with no shoes, no underthings, and no trace of outside dirt on their feet. No injuries, no bruises, just clenched jaws. Some skeletons were found with their hands bound in prayer. Others had their mouths stuffed with wax. At the edge of the property, a small wooden sign had been planted in soil so dry it cracked when touched. No one remembered it being there before. It read, Mercy is the silence of the chosen. And beneath that, in smaller script, almost invisible, Mother Agatha. None of the villagers remembered meeting a Mother Agatha. Yet over the coming weeks, her name would haunt sermons, dinner tables, and the dreams of anyone who stepped inside the house. Some claimed they could still hear the walls inhale. Others, mostly children, began to mimic the way they thought the women must have died, pressing themselves between trees, smearing chalk on their lips, playing a game they whispered as mercy. What no one could explain was this: every room in Elmstead had 3 locks, not outside, but inside, and all of them were open. There was no rain that week, yet the town of Wexham seemed perpetually damp, its people too quiet, its windows shuttered earlier than usual, and its routines subtly rearranged. The grocer left deliveries by doors instead of knocking. Children were no longer seen along the hedgerows. At the heart of the village, the bells of St. Bartholomew's rang daily. But no one could recall who had rung them. The discovery at Elmstead Retreat had pierced the town's rhythm like a cracked note in a hymn. Yet, even as reports trickled in, something stranger unfolded. No one seemed truly surprised. "It always felt wrong, that place," muttered Davy Lyle, owner of the blacksmith shop on Cradle Lane. He had been 6 years old when the Sisters of Final Mercy arrived in 1839. 3 women in grey robes who said little and asked even less. They purchased the estate from the Langford family, who'd vacated abruptly after what was described in passing as a family collapse. There was a stillness, Lyle added, staring into his forge like he expected something to emerge from the coals. Not peace. Stillness, like a breath being held. At the apothecary, Mrs. Geraldine Frey dusted off an old ledger from beneath the counter. Her ink-stained hands trembled only slightly as she traced a name last written in April of 1842. Miss Temperance Wilkes, tonics for nervous temperament, recurring nightmares. She was 15, Frey said. Her father brought her in every other Tuesday. One day he came alone and said she'd been taken into Mercy. I asked if she'd passed. He said no, she was saved. The word saved hung in the air with weight heavier than grief. It suggested a finality, but not death. Not exactly. Reverend Ellicott, too, began collecting names. He started with burial records from the parish archive, dates between 1839 and 1854. The sisters were said to have run Elmstead for the vulnerable women of God. But no one in the church had been invited inside, nor were there any baptisms or funerals registered to their care. Yet Wexham's census rolls told another story. 1841 census, Wexham Parish House, number 92. Elmstead occupants, 14 women, aged 12 to 66. No surnames listed, all marked as domestic aid. 1851 census, omitted, not listed. It's like the house disappeared off paper, Ellicott remarked in a letter to the diocesan clerk, dated 12th February, 1854. And yet the candles still burned behind those windows. I saw them myself, word spread faster than ink could catch it. Rumours blurred the line between memory and myth. One man, Thomas Orrell, a farmhand from North Row, claimed to have delivered fresh hay bales to the Elmstead barn in 1845. They paid in coin from the continent, he said, though he could not name the country. But the girls, they didn't speak. didn't blink. Far as I recall, a retired teacher, Miss Arabella Finch, said she once received a letter inviting her to teach the rescued girls scripture. The letter bore no signature. She declined and burned it. I smelled wax on the envelope, she recalled, and something else. My dog wouldn't enter the house for days after I read it aloud. The town council met in private chambers on February 10th. Their minutes, later smuggled out by a clerk's apprentice, note the following: unwise to pursue further excavation without containment. Fear of hysteria. Suggest sealing Elmstead under municipal authority and redirecting inquiry to London. But someone had already ignored that advice. 3 days later, a boy named Edward Hart was caught trying to enter the retreat. He'd been dared, he said, a cruel joke from schoolmates. They told him there were dolls inside, wax ones. He returned ashen, shaking, and mute. His fingernails had dirt beneath them, and a small linen scrap was found in his coat pocket. Upon it, stitched in red, "I am not dead." He had no memory of how it got there. A letter, discovered 2 weeks after the incident, was found folded into the parish Bible. No one admitted placing it there. It was addressed simply, "To whom remains." We were told it was God's work, that silence was the proof of our salvation. We were promised light beyond the stone, warmth behind the wall. When the wax was pressed to our lips, we were told to breathe once, and only less more. But I have not yet died. My fingers still move. I hear the hymns, but they are not sung by angels. There was no signature. As the town strained to make sense of it all, 2 camps began to emerge. One, led quietly by Ellicott and a few elders, demanded a full inquiry, re-examination of the site, official excavation, and a naming of the dead. The other, more vocal, insisted the house be razed, salted, and forgotten. "They were not of us," said Elias Bram, cousin of the mason. "They came from elsewhere." Let them return to it, but records suggest many of the girls were local, vanished daughters of farmers, seamstresses, and tradesmen, taken quietly, not all at once, one every season, enough that no one saw the full picture, until now. Behind the smithy, someone carved a message into the wooden fence. It was written with a precision unusual for children, and too small for easy reading. It said, "They buried the wrong ones." No one has claimed responsibility, and no one knows what it means. By the end of February 1854, the focus of local inquiry had narrowed to one spectral presence, the sisters themselves. Their arrival had been quiet, like a shadow settling across a table at dusk. 3 women, dressed alike in ash-grey habits with no visible insignia, had appeared in Wexham in late September of 1839. They spoke with plain English, slightly northern in accent, and carried only one document, a letter of transfer bearing the seal of the Archdeacon of Hexham. But when Reverend Ellicott requested verification in 1854, the diocese replied curtly, "There exists no record of transference for any order under the name Final Mercy. The seal presented is not one of ours." This single sentence unraveled the illusion that had stood for 15 years. The sisters had called themselves by first names only: Sister Constance, Sister Rosalind, and Mother Agatha. Of these, only Constance was ever seen regularly in the village, purchasing candles, flour, and once, oddly, 15 feet of hempen rope. Rosalind was glimpsed less often, mostly near the riverbanks, collecting herbs in silence. As for Mother Agatha, No one recalled seeing her clearly at all, only her voice, described by several as measured, deep, or like a schoolteacher in mourning. She was said to speak rarely, but when she did, people listened, even if they could not recall exactly what she had said afterward. According to postmistress Letitia Yu, a thin, meticulous woman of 59, Elmstead Retreat received no outgoing mail between 1840 and 1853. But it received 12 letters in that time, each addressed simply to M.A., Elmstead House, Wexham Parish. Letitia claimed all the letters bore foreign postmarks, some German, some from French provinces, and one with an indecipherable script she believed to be Hungarian. She never opened any, though once she held one up to the light. "I saw no ink inside," she whispered, "only an outline." Like someone had pressed wax seals along the inner fold, a small volume of handwritten pages was recovered during the initial investigation. Tucked behind a false drawer in the retreat's scullery, it was bound in waxed linen and had no title. At the top of the first page, "The Rite of Quiet Mercy," as instructed by the voice in room 3. The pages that followed were unnerving, not sacrilegious exactly, but disordered. Liturgical references taken out of context, prayers modified to remove mention of death or suffering, and recurring phrases such as, "Sound is the last lie of the flesh," "Breath is the threshold of redemption," "True obedience is sealed by stillness." The book was unsigned, but several entries referred to someone called simply the matron. Meanwhile, across town, a young girl named Hester Lorne brought forward something her grandmother had kept hidden for years, a pressed bundle of letters wrapped in lace and tied with what appeared to be twine used for rosaries. The letters were from her aunt, Judith Lorne, last seen alive in 1846 after being taken in by the sisters for what was described as a season of contemplative health. One letter, dated November 12, 1846, read, "Dearest Mamma, the quiet here is very fine. No bells ring, but we know the hours by the wax. They say I am nearly ready. Mother Agatha visits only when the sky is without color. I miss light. They say missing is part of the journey. They say it means the flesh is softening." Another, undated but clearly later, simply said, "There was a girl who wept through the wall." Then she stopped. Now they call her Prepared Judith was never heard from again. Constable Fielding, now assigned full-time to the Elmstead file, uncovered an anomaly in the property record. The deed for Elmstead, last legally transferred in 1839, lists the buyer as the Trust of Final Mercy, with no formal address. The witness to the transaction was one Dr. Giles Fenwick, a physician from London who had vanished himself in 1843 following a medical ethics inquiry in Bloomsbury. Fenwick had once written a paper archived at the Royal Society, titled "On the Neurological Control of Sound in Post-Trauma Patients." The paper proposed that extended silence under physical restraint could lead to cleansing of maladaptive voice memory loops. It was discredited, but its references bore uncanny similarity to phrases found in the Sisters' Litany. That spring, as the snow thawed, a buried artifact emerged from the base of an elm tree behind the retreat. A child, digging for beetles, struck wood. What she found was a sealed box, small, no larger than a hat case. Inside were 7 bone rings. Each had been carved with initials and dates, all from the 1840s. None matched any known gravestone in Wexham or its surrounding parishes. But one, marked TH 1843, matched a name listed in the town's orphanage departure logs, Tabitha Horn, age 11, placed into religious refuge the summer of that year. No further record exists. The last confirmed sighting of any sister occurred in August of 1853. A peddler passing through claimed he saw a pale woman on the upper balcony of Elmstead, arms crossed over her chest, face upturned to the moon. He thought little of it until he looked again an hour later, and saw her still there, motionless, the same posture, the same sky. Unblinking. He left before dawn. Back in the town's archive, Reverend Ellicott found a curious note scribbled into the margin of a parish calendar from 1841. It had no attribution, just one line. Agatha is not her name. It is what they become. As winter deepened in 1854, no one in Wexham spoke the sisters' names aloud anymore, yet their presence lingered. In dreams, in breathless pauses during prayer, in the way people no longer trusted houses with too many corridors. A new superstition emerged. Villagers began placing beeswax discs above their door frames. No one admitted why, but quietly, one woman wrote in her journal, "They sealed the girls inside the walls because their cries could not be controlled. But what if the walls were not made to trap them, only to muffle them?" The first event that broke logic occurred not within Elmstead Retreat, but in the chapel that had once refused to name it. On March 2nd, 1854, during morning vespers at St. Bartholomew's, 8 parishioners reported hearing weeping from beneath the wooden floorboards. It began at precisely 7:14 a.m., just as Reverend Ellicott reached the phrase, "The body is a house of silence, but the soul must speak." The sound was not distant, nor imagined. Multiple accounts described it as wet, rhythmic, and unmistakably feminine. When the congregation searched beneath the pulpit, they found only dry stone foundations and centuries-old burial tiles. All sealed. No moisture, no entry point, and no explanation. 2 days later, a fire broke out in the Wexham Town Records Office. It did not burn hot. Witnesses described it as cold flame, thin blue tongues of fire that consumed nothing except paper. The walls remained untouched. Wooden desks did not scorch, but a single shelf, marked Census 1830 to 1850, had been reduced to grey ash. The volunteer fireman, a man named Lewis Pycroft, stated in his incident report, "The fire did not burn through the books, it emptied them." When shown one of the singed volumes, a historian from Grenton declared the pages chemically erased, not burned. But the mechanism and motive were unclear. No accelerant was found. On March 10th, a local boy named Jono Wickes wandered into the retreat's overgrown orchard, which had been fenced off since the discovery. He was 9 years old and mute by birth. According to his mother, he returned home pale, shaking, and with soil under his fingernails. Not unusual for a boy. What was unusual was that he was humming, a low, looping melody. When questioned through gesture, he led his father to a clearing behind the orchard's northernmost elm, where he had unearthed a flat, stone marked only by 3 vertical lines. No date, no name, just 3 vertical lines. Under it was a cracked clay vessel containing what looked like a folded piece of cloth. But when it was unwrapped, they found instead a square of pressed beeswax. And pressed into it, like a seal, were words, "Take not the air, hold breath and become Jono did not speak. But that night He carved those same words onto his bedroom wall. Backward. Within days, a second anomaly struck. At the old infirmary across the road from Elmstead, long defunct, now used for grain storage, a retired nurse named Harriet Bloom was doing inventory when she came across a forgotten storeroom sealed with a nail through rope. Inside were 17 glass jars. Each held hair, all braided. Some contained locks still attached to scraps of dried scalp. Each jar bore a date, one per year, from 1839 to 1855, including 1854, which had not yet ended. There were no names, only labels etched into the glass in delicate script. Spoken once, wept twice. No breath, lightless, rose, offered. All 17 were delivered to the constables. By morning, 3 jars were missing from the locked evidence cupboard. The key had not been moved. No sign of forced entry was found. As pressure mounted, Reverend Ellicott began compiling what he called the inversions. This term referred to moments, documented and verified, in which natural law seemed inverted following the retreat's discovery. A fire that froze wood but consumed ink. A child born with lungs intact but no breath reflex, who survived 8 minutes without oxygen. A dog who barked at its own echo, but not at sound. One entry, dated March 19th, described an organist at St. Bartholomew's, whose notes reversed direction when played. Ascending tones dropped, descending rose. The instrument was later examined. No mechanical faults were found. Another entry noted that no birds had landed on the Elmstead roof since the first skeleton was uncovered. Not once. Not even crows. In an attempt to regain control of the narrative, the Wexham Council commissioned Dr. Evo Mortimer, a physician archivist from London's Bethlem Royal Hospital, to assess the townspeople for mass hysteria. His report, dated March 22nd, reads, "The townspeople exhibit no delusions, beyond what would be expected from exposure to a mass grave. However, there exists a disquieting calm, not detachment, but something more willful. A silence cultivated, perhaps ritualized. Children hum in unison, unprovoked. Windows are blacked out from the inside. There is no laughter in Wexham, but no tears either. It is as though they are practicing something." He left the town within 48 hours. His final note was verbal to the constable who escorted him to the train station. "Whatever happened inside those walls, I believe it is still happening." On March 27th, an envelope appeared on the altar at St. Bartholomew's. There was no sign of entry. Inside was a single sheet of vellum, handwritten in brown ink, not faded, but deliberately light. It read, "Forgive us." They asked to leave, but their voices held ruin. "We silenced them for your sake. We used wax. We prayed over the stone. But some still remember how to breathe. We sealed the rooms, but we forgot the chimneys." It was unsigned, but in the lower right corner, in the same script as the jars, "Offered." That night, an oil lamp in the church vestry exploded. No fire, no ignition source, no glass shards, just a ring of black smoke on the ceiling, shaped unmistakably like a woman's open mouth. By April 1st, 1854, the people of Wexham had adopted a new custom, humming before bed, low, tuneless, and brief. Mothers taught it to their children without explanation. Shopkeepers closed early and did not speak past sunset. Even the vicar's wife, once skeptical of folkish indulgences, placed a wax seal over their chimney flue and began locking her wardrobe from the outside. It was not mass hysteria. It was preparation. because the retreat had started answering back. On the morning of April 3rd, the last mason assigned to the retreat's reboarding effort, a man named Silas Kern, failed to arrive at the town depot. He had been tasked with sealing the third-floor corridor, where a narrow shaft had recently been found behind a mirror frame. It was not a stairwell, nor a dumbwaiter. It was simply a vertical gap stretching from basement to rafters. According to his wife, Silas left their home before dawn with a hammer, a chisel, and a jug of water. He wore his brown overcoat and boots lined with rabbit fur. He did not return. At 6:12 p.m., 2 constables found his boots neatly placed on the retreat's front step. Inside the building, they discovered the shaft had been filled with hundreds of white beeswax discs carefully stacked in a spiral up the center of the passage. Some were engraved with words, others bore impressions of lips. There was no sign of Silas. Not then. At 9:47 p.m., across town, the school bell rang. The schoolhouse had been closed for 6 weeks. No one was inside. No wind was reported that night, yet the bell rope had been pulled hard enough to snap. When the constables arrived, they found 3 sheets of lined paper scattered on the wooden floorboards beneath the belfry. Each bore a child's handwriting, each in different ink, but all read the same sentence. "They cannot hear us through stone." None of the local children admitted writing them. Some had not yet learned their letters. The town began locking its school books in drawers. Fear bloomed at the seams, not loud, but insistent. Shopkeepers began hammering, closed their attic vents. 2 families left without notice. 1 man was found painting his windows shut with ash and rainwater, whispering that light bleeds sound. On April 6th, Reverend Ellicott hosted an emergency sermon. Only 11 people attended. Among the empty pews, he lit every candle in the nave and spoke without notes. "The Lord answers prayer," he said, voice trembling. "But we must be certain whose voice we're using to ask." That night, his wife, Clara Ellicott, reported a dream in which a girl without a face whispered a question into her mouth. "Will you speak for me?" When she awoke, the mirror at her bedside had cracked vertically, without impact. It was April 9th when Mrs. Celandine Huxley vanished, an older woman known for her stiff spine and strict moral tongue. She had long decried the rumors surrounding the retreat as papist melodrama. But that Sunday, she failed to arrive for tea with her cousin, and was later found in her pantry, standing upright, fully dressed, with a beeswax disc clenched between her teeth. She could not explain how it got there. She simply wept. Her hands had been dipped in tallow and bound behind her back with her own curtain cords. The house was locked from the inside. She moved to a hospital in Grenton and never spoke again. The town voted the next day to burn Elmstead Retreat. The vote passed narrowly, 42 to 37. But no one volunteered to light the fire. Even the constables refused. Instead, they hired 3 outsiders from Ashcombe, labourers with no ties to Wexham. They arrived on April 12th, carrying torches, pitch, and 3 casks of kerosene. They did not leave that night. At 11:03 p.m., a witness across the field claimed to see the upper floor of the retreat flicker with light. Not firelight, but a pale blue glow that gathered, then dropped, like a breath held and released. By dawn, the men were gone. Their cart remained, horses still tethered. Inside the cart, tucked beneath a folded tarp, authorities found a narrow sheet of parchment, damp but intact. It read, "We were wrong to try." The walls will not forget. We were inside before we knew we had entered. There was no signature. But stamped at the bottom was a circle of wax with 3 lines etched through it. The name Tabitha Horn resurfaced that week. A gravestone bearing her name was discovered in Barrowfell, 46 miles north, in a disused cemetery tied to an abandoned monastery. The headstone read, Tabitha Horn, born 1832, died 1843. She spoke, she paid, yet no burial records exist, no death certificate, and Tabitha, as previously uncovered, had been listed in Wexham orphanage records in 1843, the very year etched on her stone. More disturbingly, the grave was empty. A broken doll's head was found in the earth below. Etched along its scalp in microscopic lines, she breathes still. On April 14th, one final horror arrived. Silas Kern's body was found, entombed upright inside the retreat's cellar wall, beneath the floorboards of what had once been the sisters' chapel. He had not rotted. He had not moved. His hands were pressed to his own mouth, fingers locked in rigor. He was facing inward. Carved in, delicate script on the wall beside him. He listened too long. And above his head, placed neatly on a shelf of stone, sat his hammer, the handle wrapped in hair. By month's end, most of Wexham no longer spoke at all. A collective stillness had settled over the village. It was not silence by abstention, but by habit. Children no longer cried. Adults nodded instead of greeting. Even the sparrows no longer sang in the hedges near the retreat. And yet, each night, some claimed to hear voices in their chimneys. Faint at first, then clearer, until one phrase repeated, "The breath is the sin." The town has never formally recorded these accounts, nor has any academic paper verified them. But the evidence remains, in cracked mirrors, in scorched journals, in wax that keeps reappearing behind the wainscoting of homes built long after the retreat was sealed. The Wexham Historical Committee did not begin its formal investigation until 1891, nearly 4 decades after the Elmstead retreat was abandoned and quietly boarded by the county. By then, many of the original townspeople had died or relocated. The children who once hummed at night were adults now. Most unwilling to speak of what had happened, some refused to admit it ever occurred. But history has a way of leaving seams, faint threads in pages, marginal notes, inconsistencies in land surveys, misplaced letters. It was in these forgotten corners that the horror revealed its roots. In early May of 1891, Dr. Edwin Darnley, a regional archivist and former lecturer at Durham, was cataloguing donation materials from a shuttered Grenton law office when he found a sealed wooden folio box. It bore no title, only a pressed symbol. 3 vertical lines. Inside, Darnley found a packet of correspondence tied in black ribbon and wrapped in aged muslin. The ink was faded, the handwriting small and angular. Mostly Latin, some archaic English. One letter stood out. It was dated August 3rd, 1796, and addressed to the custodian of the Quiet Order, Kent Cellar, Wexham Vicariate. The body of the letter read, "The final sermon was delivered without incident. The girls have begun their withdrawal fast, though one cried for her mother this morning. We soothed her with the rite of still breath. Sister Agatha believes the rebellion is now fully purged from the collective. Only 3 remain to be folded. We have buried the forbidden pages beneath the cornerstone, as instructed. None but the mute may inherit this place. Their lungs do not lie. The letter was signed only S.R. Darnley traced the reference to a now vanished sect known as the Quiet Order, a fringe religious community believed to have operated throughout isolated regions of northern England from the late 1700s through the mid-19th century. Their philosophy was unclear. No official records of doctrine exist. But one theological pamphlet from 1802, housed in the University of York's rare books collection, contained a handwritten marginalia next to a passage about resurrection. It read, "The voice is the wound by which sin re-enters. Seal it, and the soul may pass unspoiled." The pamphlet itself was unremarkable, but it had once belonged to Dr. Giles Fenwick, the same man who notarized Elmstead's property transfer in 1839. His personal copy bore a wax stain on the inner cover, shaped like an open mouth pressed in profile. A deeper mystery surfaced when an old probate inventory from 1844 was discovered in the county archives. The estate belonged to Matilda Horne, an unmarried woman of means who died of natural quiet, a phrase unfamiliar to medical certifiers of the period. Among her listed possessions was one peculiar item: cabinet box containing names of the offered, kept under linen in cellar. Not to be opened, the cabinet itself was never recovered. But years later, in 1903, renovations at the former Horne residence uncovered a hollow beneath the hearth. Inside, a leather pouch with 17 slips of vellum, each bearing a girl's first name, a date, and the word offered. Several names matched prior victims identified at Elmstead. One, however, Beatrice C., 1841, matched no known record in Wexham, but did appear in a parish confession log from a neighbouring village dated July 1842. The entry read, "Mrs. Carraway claims she delivered her sister's child, Beatrice, to the sisters across the ridge. Said they promised cleansing. Later learned Beatrice was not seen again. Feels guilt, but cannot undo obedience." The confession was unsigned. The name Carraway does not appear again in local records. Meanwhile, an aging member of the Wexham Council, Edward Leach, 81, blind in one eye, offered Darnley an artifact long kept hidden in his family, a pocket watch, brass, not ticking. Inside, under the glass cover, was a curled piece of hair sealed in resin and a miniature etched on copper. The image, a staircase with no handrail, descending into darkness. On the back of the case, inscribed in a slow, nervous hand, "She followed the hymn downward." Leach claimed it had belonged to his grandmother's cousin, a girl named Mina, who had gone to study under the sisters and never returned. "She hummed even in her sleep," he said. "After she vanished, no one hummed in our house again." The final and most damning clue came from beneath Elmstead itself. In 1908, the Retreats Foundation was partially exposed during trenching for a new telegraph line. Labourers uncovered a brick vault sealed with plaster and lined with wax. Within the vault were 8 bound volumes, their spines labelled by year, 1839 to 1847. They were not diaries, nor ledgers. They were transcripts. Each page bore the date and time of an offering, followed by a description. March 5th, 1841. Eleanor C., age 15, asked to speak to her brother. Given an hour of stilling, mouth sealed at 6:15, sound ceased at 6:22. Nails blooded from wall scratch, burial planned for wall cavity 7C. Another, dated December 9th, 1844. 2 resisted. Twin girls, unnamed, wax applied during song. 1 continued vocalizing after seal, Require increased volume. Walling complete by 9:40. Volume 7 contained a break in pattern. There, in a hurried, trembling script, we have misjudged breath. It is not the enemy. It is the alarm. They scream not from rebellion, but from recognition. The walls listen back. The final page bore only a diagram. 3 circles interlocking, surrounded by the words, Sanctum via Silentium. Underneath, pressed in with dry fingers, the Wexham Committee buried the vault again. The volumes were archived, sealed, and marked under restricted theological inquiry. As of this writing, they are housed at an undisclosed facility maintained by the Diocese of Hexham and Newcastle. No official statement has ever been made, but one page was leaked. A photo of the diagram appeared in a fringe journal in 1976, alongside a short article titled The Forgotten Rite of Sealed Breath, Echoes of a British Monastic Tragedy. The journal folded after its second issue. Today, little remains of Elmstead Retreat. The structure was razed in 1913, its stone used to build a railway depot that no longer stands. But near the edge of the former orchard, one tree, an elm, remains rooted. Its bark, if studied closely, reveals 3 vertical scars. Locals say the tree does not grow leaves until midsummer, no matter the warmth of spring. Some believe it breathes differently. By the spring of 1910, most believed Elmstead had been forgotten. The land was unsold, the retreat razed, and the story reduced to a local cautionary tale rarely shared outside Wexham. But truth has a way of pulling back the curtain, not loudly, but precisely. That April, a group of surveyors from Telegraph South and Midland were tasked with measuring land gradients for a proposed telegraph line reconnecting rural parishes. Wexham, with its low water table and high elevation ridge, was one such site. They were not told of Elmstead. No records marked it, but their instruments began to fail within a 60-meter radius of the old orchard. Compass needles spun, altimeters dropped by 3 feet in a still field, and the theodolite used for triangulation tilted exactly 5 degrees east, no matter where they set it. Foreman Gareth Hollow, a veteran of 20 years with the firm, returned alone the following evening to take manual readings. He left a note with his assistant stating, "Likely magnetic interference. Will cross-check with analog method tonight." He never returned. 3 days later, his boots were discovered, placed side by side on the edge of the elm tree's shallow root crown. Beneath the bark, someone had carved the phrase, "He tried to measure what should not move." His field notes were recovered from the satchel found nearby. The last page read, "It sounds like breathing." Measured at 14-second intervals. Coming from under the ground, by May, county officials were dispatched to assess the site. They sent a small team of civil engineers, 1 botanist, and a liaison from the Church of England. At 2:14 p.m. on May 9th, during the core drilling procedure, a hollow cavity was struck at a depth of 14 feet. No soil collapse occurred, but the drill, upon removal, emerged coated in a thick, translucent wax. A strange smell followed. Not rot, but something described in the report as sweetened iron, like blood and roses. Several engineers refused to continue. The church liaison, a man named Father Peter Hawthorne, remained behind that night. He kept a detailed journal, fragments of which survive. His entry from that evening. I walked the orchard alone at 11 p.m. I could feel my ribs pulse, not from fear, but resonance, like a tuning fork. I whispered the litany of quiet, which I have not said since seminary. The words came unbidden. At precisely 11:47, the elm tree exhaled. I felt it, not with ears, but with pressure. The candle I carried bent sideways in its flame. And then I heard her. She said, "You buried the wrong ones." Father Hawthorne was found the next morning in the orchard's shallow trench, arms folded across his chest, mouth packed with beeswax. The medical report stated no physical trauma, no signs of struggle. His larynx was intact, but his lungs were empty, not collapsed, not punctured, just void. Within weeks, the Royal Geological Society requested access to the site. It was denied. Instead, a decision was made quietly to backfill the cavity and designate the land as protected marshland, citing unstable soil integrity and unsuitable substrate for civic development. But a worker from the backfill crew smuggled out a single object, a ring, made of glass, fused with ash. It had no joint or break. Embedded inside were hair fibers, braided into the shape of a 3-petaled flower, etched around the inside in needlepoint font. Last breath held. She became the worker. A man named Thomas Vexley reportedly sold the ring to a collector in Leeds. 3 months later, he was found drowned in a shallow pond, lungs unfilled with water. The coroner's note read, "He did not breathe water. He simply ceased to breathe at all." The elm tree was cut down in 1913, under the pretense of fungal rot. But when the saws reached the heartwood, they found a cavity inside the trunk. Perfectly cylindrical, approximately the size of a small child curled in prayer. Inside was a folded linen smock, untouched by decay, pinned to it with a bone needle, a final note, handwritten in brown-black ink, uneven and sloping. "We sealed the girls who screamed." But one never made a sound. She watched. She remembers. A railway depot was built over the foundation using stone from the retreat. It operated from 1914 to 1922. 7 conductors quit during that period. 2 reported hearing names spoken over the rails when no passengers were present. 1 engineer claimed the air pressure in the operator's cabin would drop suddenly, like someone was inhaling everything at once. The depot burned in 1923. No cause determined. Today the land is quiet. A sign reads, "Wexham Orchard Reserve, no public access." But those who live nearby still note oddities. Dogs do not bark there. Candles burn unevenly. And during the coldest nights of winter, when fog pools low to the ground and chimneys go unused, locals say you can hear the faint murmur of humming, always just behind you, and always in 3-beat rhythm. 1 woman, a teacher who passed through the area in 2009, recorded ambient sound for a field project on rural silence. When she played it back, there was only one thing on the tape: breath, measured, held, then cut short. Today, Elmstead Retreat no longer exists, not in stone, nor beam, nor steeple. Its foundations lie buried beneath a shallow stretch of protected land, designated as a wildlife corridor by the Wexham Parish Council in 1954. No monument marks it, no plaque, only a wrought iron gate, rusted and sealed, stands at the edge of the former orchard path. A gate that leads nowhere. And yet, despite the disappearance of structure, the story persists. Not loudly, but insistently. In 1978, a doctoral candidate named Rowan Ellicott, great-grandson of Reverend Paul Ellicott, submitted a thesis to Durham University titled "Vocal Suppression Rituals in Rural Northern England," a study of pre-Victorian ecclesiastical deviance. The thesis was rejected. Officially, it was dismissed on grounds of insufficient source attribution. Unofficially, it was due to the inclusion of unsanctioned transcripts. Entries Rowan claimed were taken from the sealed vault diaries recovered during the 1908 trenching. He cited a family key, passed down, that once opened a compartment beneath the old church lectern. That compartment, he wrote, had contained microfilm copies made before the diaries were removed. No such microfilm was ever found. Rowan disappeared in 1981 while hiking near the Pennines. His tent was found zipped from the inside, undisturbed. His recorder was recovered and catalogued by local authorities. The final entry was static, followed by a single whispered word: mercy. In 1993, a maintenance worker assigned to rewire the basement of the Wexham Historical Archive discovered a collection of wax seals hidden in the insulation above a storage cavity. Each was pressed flat and wrapped in linen. None had adhesive. They appeared designed to be placed over mouths, not envelopes. The seals were catalogued, tagged, and forgotten for 20 years. Until one researcher, Dr. Lillian March, began matching their impressions to death records. Of the 67 wax seals, 61 corresponded exactly with documented women and girls who vanished between 1839 and 1854. The remaining 6 had no match. Instead, their impressions bore not letters, but symbols: a staircase, a closed eye, a treble clef, 3 vertical lines, an inverted chalice, a hand without fingers. When Dr. March reached out to linguists and semioticians for analysis, her communication ceased abruptly. She left her office the next morning without a word. Her voice, colleagues say, has not been heard since. She writes only on small scraps of wax paper. The chimney theory, as it came to be known in fringe circles, suggests that the Sisters of Final Mercy believed air, breath itself, was not a gift, but a conduit. That sound allowed trauma, memory, or possession to spread from one soul to another. This theory proposes that when the walls of Elmstead were sealed, the sisters failed to consider the narrow vertical structures left open. Chimneys, flues, root shafts, all of which lead back into the homes of the village, into the mouths of the living. It may explain why, for decades, certain homes in Wexham experienced mirror fog in rooms without heat, or why children were reported humming in their sleep without ever being taught the tune. One journalist, Angela Price, writing for the Northern Record in 2006, attempted to track the descendants of the retreat's victims. Her draft article, never published, included the following line: "Of the 67 known girls, only one line continues uninterrupted today. All others disappear before the second generation." Price vanished in 2007, en route to an interview in Grenton. Her last phone call was to her editor. She left one message: "The tree is humming." No one can say with certainty whether the events of Elmstead Retreat were the result of religious extremism, a psychological experiment cloaked in doctrine, or something more unknowable. The archival evidence points to ritualized vocal suppression. The testimonies suggest supernatural consequence. The soil suggests no disturbance. The air, however, continues to suggest something else. In 2021, a group of amateur researchers recorded ambient low-frequency sound near the site using subsonic mics. They filtered out wind, engine noise, and wildlife. What remained was a faint, rhythmic pattern. Not a voice, but not random. A forensic audiologist noted it resembled controlled diaphragmatic contractions, typical of prolonged breath retention, the kind trained singers or divers use. And yet, it came from no identifiable source. One final document remains, archived in a private collection, location undisclosed, but referenced in a confidential catalogue donated to the British Library. It is a letter, postmarked from Wexham in 1855, addressed to the Bishop of Durham, and signed with 3 letters, M.A. We did not silence them. We transformed them. We removed the wound and replaced it with watchfulness. They no longer scream, Bishop. They echo. They echo through breath, through space, through the stone. They do not cry for help. They ask you to remember when the breath is still, the truth will return. Wexham is quiet now. There are no graves for the 67 women, no sermons for the vanished, no names chiseled into parish ledgers. But in some homes, particularly older ones with original stone fireplaces, residents still report a draught that comes not down from the chimney, but up from it, a reverse exhalation. It carries no heat, only the faintest smell of wax, and sometimes beneath that, something else, linen, cold ash, and the soft rustle of a girl's breath held too long. Thank you for listening. If you believe this story should never be buried again, and you want to hear more like it, subscribe for future episodes that uncover the quiet horrors lurking just beneath history's surface. And ask yourself, when's the last time you listened closely to the silence inside your walls?